This is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Pay heed all who enter and beware this podcast. That's right, this is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, along with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And Kevin, we talked last week. Listen, we're officially in at a single number of digits of weeks until KU football is back. We are now 9 weeks away from KU taking the field in 2024, as they'll be hosting Lindenwood at Children's Mercy Park on August 29th. We're 9 weeks away, so we are getting close. We're in the single digits. It's coming, I promise. We'll get there.
It's downhill. It's rolling downhill now.
Yeah, we're getting closer. And as we've gone through the offseason here, we've had our Jayhawk Rewind series, and we're going to have another episode here today, breaking down another game from 2023 to see if we can learn anything heading into 2024 for KU. So if you've been following along through our series, first off, thank you very much for listening and listening throughout this offseason as we go through the Jayhawk Rewind through each game from 2023. If you like what you're hearing or if you like what you're watching, if you're watching on YouTube, leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe, give us a 5-star rating and review if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, and let us know your thoughts as well as we go through this offseason, heading into one of the more highly anticipated football seasons for KU in a long time, as Kansas has a favorable schedule, and also they could be in position to make the Big 12 title game and possibly go to the College Bowl playoff with the expansion of the College Bowl playoff. So you definitely want to stay with us through our coverage all throughout this offseason into the fall of KU football here on the Paid Podcast. As I said, we're moving through the 2023 season here with the Jayhawk Rewind. We are into week 6. Kansas comes into this game against UCF with a 4-1 record against UCF after the loss against Texas. Kansas up with their first loss after starting the season 4-0. They're 4-1, taking on UCF, coming back to Lawrence after the loss against Texas. And obviously, you had the devastating situation of Jalen Daniels being ruled out at the last minute. And this was an interesting game against UCF because this was the game in which both teams had serious quarterback questions. For Kansas, it would seem as though Jason Bean was going to be getting the start after what happened with Jalen Daniels, where he was unable to play against Texas. And for UCF, they were in a similar situation where they had been relying on a backup in Timmy McClain for their past couple games, with John Race Plumlee, the starter, dealing with a knee injury, and he was potentially able to come back. It was very unclear. The waters were very murky throughout the week on this one, with both teams on the quarterback side. Kansas obviously doing their usual, kind of playing it close to the vest. UCF kind of going back and forth about what the status of Plumlee is. But the bottom line is Kansas is coming back home, and they're trying to right the ship after a loss against Texas back at home at David Booth Kansas Memorial Stadium. What was kind of your thoughts going through the week building up to this game for KU as they tried to bounce back after the first loss of 2023?
Yeah, Plumlee was a big part of it because you felt like, man, Kansas just lost its quarterback. UCF maybe getting its star quarterback back. And as the week went on, you kind of felt like it seemed like Plumlee was going to play. And he, played the first 2 games, had been out about a month. An incredibly fast quarterback, great speed. We've talked on the show in previous episodes about how Kansas had given up some plays to quarterbacks on the run, whether, they were scramble plays or whatever else. I think something else, Nick, that I was looking at, and I don't know if you felt the same way, Kansas didn't match up athletically with Texas. We knew that part. Nevada. Kansas actually, I feel like, had maybe some issues with Nevada's speed on the outside. And when you looked at this game, I think you felt like Kansas is maybe going to be better in the trenches, but you did wonder a little bit, is Kansas going to be able to slow down UCF's offense, especially with some of the athletes that they had in that group? They go to K-State. I think they hung 31 points with McClain playing. They were coming off a game where they had scored 35 or 36 points with McClain playing. And so with it looking like Plumlee was coming back with all the weapons around him, with R.J. Harvey, a running back, with the wideouts that they had, Kobe Hudson being a speed demon and all of those guys, I think this is a question mark for the Kansas defense to say, hey, how are they going to match up with the speed of UCF on that line?
Yeah. And to your point, UCF was coming off of a wild game against Baylor, if you recall, in which it was just absolute chaos. You had that play, that somewhat famous play with McLean running around for like 30 seconds on fourth down late in the game and making a crazy throw to keep their game alive. They ended up losing that one against Baylor. So, I had questions about how inspired UCF was going to be coming into this game because of the fact that they're coming off such an emotional loss the week before at home against Baylor. But yeah, this was an interesting game for a lot of different reasons. But I kind of compared this UCF game to the game against Illinois. Another opportunity, sort of a measuring stick game for KU, where in the Illinois game, it was obviously the physical toughness of Illinois. You expected them to be a team that was going to try to dominate in the trenches and run the ball. And UCF posed a bit of a different threat with their speed, which you alluded to as well. And listen, I don't want to take anything away from McLean. McLean certainly in and of his own right is a quality runner.
Sure.
But yeah, I was definitely very scared of Reese Plumlee because Kansas had struggled to stop quarterback scrambles earlier in the year. And so this was one where I felt this was going to be an interesting challenge for Kansas. And I don't want to say that I was overly confident heading into this one for KU, especially after the loss. And again, it's hard to put in context, hindsight's 2020, but this was kind of pre-Jason Bean becoming the Jason Bean that he became, right?
Yep,
so this situation where I think it was much more of, you're just asking Jason Bean to sort of manage the game and not really try to do too much and make mistakes, which we'd seen him do in the past and previous seasons for KU. He hadn't really evolved yet into that sort of quality quarterback that KU was able to rely on later in the season. And so that was kind of a concern, I think, heading in, was with Jason Bean, it's not so much the plays that Jason Bean can make, it's so much the plays that you hope he doesn't make in terms of the turnovers, in terms of, things like that. So that was kind of a concern heading into this one. And I think UCF was a formidable opponent, a team that Kansas could not overlook coming into Lawrence.
Yeah, you didn't know yet that UCF was going to struggle as much as they wound up doing over the course of the season. I think one of the things that I looked at heading in was you feel like this is going to be a shootout, right? You think that Kansas' defense is coming off giving up 80 bajillion yards to Texas, even though they were able to, kind of tighten down once they got inside the red zone. But then you look at the fact that you've got Jason Bean. He has a week to prepare. You figure he's going to look better, actually having that preparation time. But do you have enough firepower to win a shootout, to win a 45-42 game with Jason Bean as your quarterback? And at that point, I'm not sure they had an answer. And UCF gets the ball first. You're kind of interested to see, do they march right down the field? What happens? And Kansas gets a stop.
Yeah, this was a game that kind of had a bit of a sleepy start. Both teams kind of slowly warmed into this one. You mentioned UCF got the ball first. They didn't really do that much. They were able to drive a little bit. They got into Kansas territory, and they ended up with a 4th and 16 actually from the KU 36. KU benefited from a couple of penalties that kind of drove UCF to the fringe of field goal range, and they ended up punting and kind of pitting Kansas back. And Kansas proceeds to go down on a long field goal drive, in which they were able to get a couple of big plays. There was a big pass from Jason Bean to Luke Grimm on the drive. Devin Neal had a big run on the drive. Kansas goes down into, and listen, we talked about this going back to the BYU game. 7-minute field goal drives are terrible. They suck. They're not good. Only in very specific circumstances are they good. This is a situation where it was not good. Kansas does indeed. They go on a 13-play, 82-yard, 7-minute field goal drive. Seth Kelly kicks a field goal on 4th down and goal from the 3 for KU to get on the board. At that point, it's 3-0, right? And it's like, okay, fine. Again, 7-minute drives that ended field goals are generally more frustrating than not, though.
You could have listened to an audiobook over the course of that drive. Like it was that long. And the amazing thing is they only faced 2 third downs. They had a 3rd and 1 that they converted with. I think Devin Neal got like basically a shotgun, like a wildcat touch where he got a couple yards and kept it going. They didn't face another one up until they got stopped. And Jason Bean has a pass attempt to Quentin Skinner. It goes incomplete. One of the few incompletions for Jason Bean on the day. Jason Bean, they didn't really ask to do a whole lot in terms of throwing the ball. Like you said, they asked him more to be sort of that game manager type. In that situation, you have the incomplete pass. UCF winds up getting the ball back, down 3-0. And Kansas gets a real quick 3 and out. And we should have mentioned, we haven't yet, Plumlee was starting. He came out and started for UCF, and Kansas's defense really came to play early, and that enabled them. You talked about a sleepy start. That enabled them to kind of roll into this thing a little bit. And, it wasn't a situation where, oh my gosh, we're down 14-3 or whatever else. It enabled them to find their pace a little bit, and Kansas did that on its next drive.
Yeah, and I will say this. John Reese told me, like you said, started. We kind of glossed over that, but he ended up starting. But it became pretty clear very quickly that he was not himself, that he was not fully 100%. And UCF tried to run him out again for the next drive, and it just wasn't working. And eventually they did end up just committing to Timmy McClain as their quarterback. And you do have to wonder, and I wonder if maybe Gus Malzahn or the UCF staff looks back at a game like this and thinks to themselves, man, maybe if we start doing Timmy McClain for the whole game, we don't struggle to begin, and maybe we are able to get the jump on KU a little bit more early in the game. But yeah, as it kind of stands, I felt it watching this game, there was a lot of confusion on the UCF side about sort of what their game plan was because of the fact that Plumlee was in, but he clearly wasn't 100%. And then they tried to bring in McClain, and then Plumlee. So it was interesting. Plumlee, he comes out on the first drive, and McClain goes in, and then they bring Plumlee out again on the next drive, on their second drive where they go 3 and out. So it was a really interesting sort of start to the game for that reason because it really stalled UCF out. And to your point, it did allow Kansas to sort of get things going. I do want to get more into this game, dive more into this game here on the Paid Podcast. But first, we have to take a break and tell you about our friends at Home Field Apparel. You can check out Home Field Apparel at homefieldapparel.com. They've got over 30 different Kansas items. I got the Jayhawk shirt here on today from Home Field Apparel. They've got anything you can really want from KU. They've also got 130 other colleges, and they even have some professional sports as well you can check out. And if you are a first-time customer at homefieldapparel.com, we have you covered here on the Paid Podcast. If you use the promo code KCSN23, you get 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. That's 15% off your first order with code KCSN23 at homefieldapparel.com. We're back with more here on the Paid Podcast coming up next.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer with Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you're hearing or watching, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to leave us a subscribe, give us a 5-star rating and review, leave us a comment, let us know your thoughts, leave us a like as well on YouTube as we go through the offseason with our offseason series here, the Jayhawk Rewind. This is the 6th game of the season for Kansas against UCF at 4-1. And as we said before the break, kind of a slow start to this game for both teams. At this point, it's 3-0. Kansas is ahead after their long field goal drive. They force a quick 3-and-out, though, from UCF. They get the ball back, and this time they're able to go down and get a touchdown. And I was really impressed by Kansas's run game. I'm sure we'll talk plenty more about this as we go through the scene, Kevin, but the running game for Kansas was very effective basically the whole day. And it was on display on this next drive for Kansas up 3-0 as Devin Neal had a couple of long runs on the drive. Daniel Highshaw had a couple of nice runs on the drive, but it actually ends with a Jason Bean touchdown pass to Lawrence Arnold. And that puts Kansas up 10-0. And at this point, if you're KU, you're feeling pretty good because I think you've recognized, hey, UCF is in a bit of dysfunction on offense because of their quarterback situation. And now we've been able to go down and put together a drive and take the lead and make it a 2-possession game at this point.
Yeah, and a great play by Arnold on the touchdown. He kind of bullies the defensive back and then reaches the ball across for a touchdown. And that really felt like it changed the trajectory of the game. Getting the actual touchdown on that was a third down play, I think a 3rd and 3 that they connected on the touchdown with. If you get another field goal there, all of a sudden you're like, man, 2 long drives and not a whole lot to show for it. UCF gets the ball back. It's Plumlee again. It's a 3-and-out again. 2 of his 3 drives that he was in for were 3-and-outs. And at that point, I think, like you said, if you didn't see before that things were not right with Plumlee, it was pretty apparent there. And that was his last action. UCF winds up pulling him out in favor of McLean at that point, but a lot of the damage was already done because Kansas went out and just pushed the ball right down the field all over again. Running attack, good again. Jason Bean completes a 6-yard pass to Mason Fairchild on a 3rd down. He also has like a little screen throw to Devin Neal, who gets about 14 yards. So running game without running the ball, even on a pass play. But Kansas goes down, makes it 17-0. And at this point, UCF is really reeling. And they've been on the field a long time, defensively. And you really felt like at that point, it would take sort of a not necessarily a seismic shift, but it would take something pretty big to get UCF back in the game at that point.
Yeah, I mean, the floodgates kind of opened for KU in the second quarter. And to your point, at that point, with Kansas up 17-0, their 3 scoring drives were 7 minutes, 4.5 minutes, and over 6 minutes, right? So these are long scoring drives for KU in which the defense had to be out there for a long time. So Kansas goes up 17-0, and like I said, the floodgates kind of opened up for KU at that point. And then you see the electricity of Trevor Wilson in the very next series as UCF, again, really unable to get anything going. They had a nice run to start their next drive, actually about a 20-yard run from RJ Arby, who Arby's the guy to keep an eye on for 2024, Kevin. Yeah. He's a guy that could end up being one of the top backs in the league, actually, for UCF. I did a nice run to start the drive, and then a false start kind of stalls it out. Eventually, UCF is forced to punt. And then you get to see Trevor Wilson really at his best with an 82-yard punt return for touchdown. One of the highlights of the season probably up to that point, with Wilson zigging and zagging his way through the UCF punt coverage and scoring. And yeah, at that point, you go up 24-0 and things are looking good for KU.
Yeah, I wasn't at this game, but I talked to people who were, and one of the things that they said was that may have been the loudest that the booth was all year in terms of that Trevor Wilson return. And you look at it, the gunner comes totally free, has almost a clean shot at him. It's one of those things where a lot of people would have probably said, hey, take the fair catch in this situation. Instead, he makes a guy miss. He gets a little bit of a return. You say, okay, this is going to be a nice 10 or 15-yard return. He jukes again, and things just kind of open up for him. And it's kind of funny because on the day, Kansas only had 2 returns, 1 punt and 1 kickoff return. On the kickoff return, Kenny Logan almost housed it, and the punt return they did house. And so when you look at the combination of, the running game, how physical things were, how, worn down UCF was getting, and then you add in the big plays like that on special teams, Kansas was really clicking on all cylinders. And I think not necessarily that you say at that point, hey, the game's over, UCF has no chance, but you would have given just about any type of odds to bet on Kansas at that point. It was really one of those things. It's just, a little bit before the half, maybe UCF, if it's 17-0 or if they manage to get like a field goal or something and go into the locker room down 2 scores where they're going to know, okay, it's Timmy McLean for the second half. We know what we're rolling with. This is going to be okay. It might have been a little bit of a different ball game, but at 24-0, Nick, at that point, it certainly felt like all it was over. It was all over except for the celebrating.
Yeah, and listen, special teams under Lance Leipold at KU over the past couple of years, I mean, it's been up and down, right? There's been some highlights like this play for Trevor Wilson for a punt return against UCF, and there's been some lowlights over the past couple seasons as well, special teams. And that's something we're looking forward to 2024. I'm very curious about, right? Because when you start to become a team like Kansas where you have those aspirations to make the Big 12 title, you have those aspirations to make it to the college football playoff, right? Suddenly special teams and winning on the margins becomes more important for Kansas, right? I constantly think back to when Kansas was struggling, right, over the past better part of a decade. things like special teams, it just didn't matter because KU was getting beat in so many other areas that just didn't matter, right? But now that KU's in the position they are, special teams to me is something that I really want to highlight because I think it's important. And they went out with Seth Keller last year, which I'm sure we'll talk more about Seth Keller over the course of this Rewind series because there's some games where he plays a factor both positively and negatively in the outcomes. But this is a situation where I think Kansas, they want to make sure their special teams are shored up, right? And it's nice to have a weapon like Trevor Wilson who can do what he does. I know we'll get to the K-State game later on and we'll talk about sort of the bad parts of that. But in this game, you see, he's able to be that X factor and kind of, like you were alluding to, sort of basically put the nail in the coffin in the second quarter for UCF, right?
Well, and don't forget, he's coming off a game where he had the long touchdown catch against Texas too. And so as much as all of us kind of went in saying Kansas has sort of a big three at wide receiver, at this point you're kind of feeling like, okay, Trevor Wilson's a weapon in his own right. And one of the things, when you get better across your whole roster, your special teams tend to improve because when you're bad, you're either your depth isn't good enough to be good on special teams, or you're playing your starters in those positions and they're playing a lot of reps and they're in situations where they can't necessarily be effective there. With Kansas having a deeper roster and more experience, and even just saying, hey, they've got 85 scholarship players, which was a non-starter for a long time. I think that's one of the biggest areas where you see improvement is, the gunning on kickoffs and punts, the ability to return and things like that, because the guy out there now is better than the guy who was out there 5 years ago, because either he's better than the depth guy you would have had in there, or he's not a starter playing his 80th play of the game. And so I think that's a major area. And it's funny that you bring up Keller and the kicking game because, while this game was pretty much over, the kicking game does wind up factoring in and maybe preview for something that's going to happen a little bit later. But, Kansas scores that touchdown. It looks like it's pretty much over. Kansas winds up getting a stop. Timmy McClain gets sacked. He kind of tries to throw the ball, but it slips out of his hand. It's recovered by DJ Withers, and Kansas is back in business, at the UCF 49 right before half, with about a minute and a half left. And you say, okay, you can actually put the nail in the coffin in here. It doesn't wind up happening. You have an incomplete pass to Quentin Skinner. Jason Bean gets sacked. Kansas winds up running, Devin Neal on 3rd and long, just basically saying, okay, that was a dud of a drive. But you're heading into the locker room at that point up 24-0 and feeling pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, but to your point on that last drive, that was a moment where you felt like Jalen Daniels maybe is able to make something happen there.
Yeah.
And this was very early in the evolution of Jason Bean in last season, and so he wasn't maybe quite up to the task of doing that as he was maybe later on in the season. But that just goes to show you, right? I mean, that just goes to show you the difference that you can have if you have a quarterback that you feel very confident in late in the game or late in the drive, late in the half to try to make something happen. And it just didn't happen for Kansas there. And obviously it didn't end up hurting them at all. But that's something to keep in mind going into 2024 as well is, if Jalen Daniels is able to stay healthy, you would think that would give KU the benefit of the doubt in those situations where, hey, there's a minute 30 left and you have a timeout. Let's go try to score, right? And you see it's a different strategy, right? You see coaches obviously go both ways on this, where some coaches will go more conservative, some coaches will try to get aggressive. And I don't know how you feel, Kevin, but obviously if I have Jalen Daniels and I have more than 45 seconds, I'm probably trying to go score because I trusted Jalen Daniels trying to make something happen.
Well, you look at the way the Illinois first half ended and what they were able to do there, and I'm right there with you, and I think it's one of those things where you look at it at that point after Bean has been sacked, you're facing a 3rd and long, and you're just kind of like, the one thing, you're up 24-0, the one thing that can sort of put you in a bad spot is some sort of turnover that enables UCF to build some positive momentum and potentially points heading into the locker room. But you go to the locker room, you're up 24-0, and Kansas gets the ball first, to start the half, and it did not take long, Dave.
Yeah. The momentum continued for Kansas to start the second half as you see the electricity of Devin Neal on the first play of the third quarter, probably still with many people trying to get back to their seats in the booth after maybe getting some refreshments at halftime. And Devin Neal, he's not waiting for you to get back to your seat, man. He is going to the house, 75 yards on the first play of the second half to really, really emphasize the dominance of Kansas in this game. And again, that's what Devin Neal can bring, right? And I think that's what makes this Kansas team so exciting heading into 2024 is you have Devin Neal, who has that one-step, one-cut ability and can turn a 5-yard run into a 75-yard run. You're going to have Trevor Wilson back, who I'm sure will be a factor in special teams. You obviously have your other stable of weapons that you have at the wide receiver position already as well, plus Jalen Daniels if he's able to stay healthy. So, any chance I get to sort of highlight the ability of Devin Neal and how he can turn a routine play into a touchdown, it's awesome to see, and it happened again here against UCF.
Yeah, there were some really good things to like about it too. I mean, on one hand, we talked about how Devin Neal was a different player as a junior than he was as a sophomore. I'm not sure sophomore year Devin Neal outruns the UCF defense for 75 yards or a touchdown. That may be a 45-yard gain or whatever. But look at the different ways that he touched the ball, right? He had like a one-handed catch on the screen pass that, he wound up scoring on. They ran some wildcat-type stuff with he and Highshaw. And I think, and I'm going to knock on wood and not really loudly when I say this, but with Jalen Daniels having sort of the injury history and things that he has, Kansas has had they've shown different ways to make sure that Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw can get the ball in creative spaces and have the ability to do different things. You saw it against K-State, when Cole Ballard started. And I think when we look at things to take forward into 2024, which is kind of what a lot of this series is, one of the things is if something winds up happening, and again, knocking on wood and God forbid, I do think that Kansas has sort of this runway that they've shown for things that they can do to protect the quarterback, that maybe they aren't 100% sure of just yet, and allow that quarterback to game manage. And I think that this whole game is really a great example, Nick, of what they were able to do, where they said to Jason Bean, like, it's okay. Like, manage this game, and we've got you with the other things that we're going to do, with the way that they're going to run the ball. We can take a lot off of your plate and let you get comfortable. And I think that's something really important moving forward into this year as well.
Yeah, and I also think, there will be some situations where KU fans will look and say, why isn't Devin Neal just getting 25, 30 carries a game, right? Like, he's that level of a dynamic player. But the reality is, you don't want to wear him down, right? You don't want to have to overwork him. And I think coupled with the fact that what you talked about with kind of helping the quarterback, on top of that, with Daniel Highshaw, with even like a Torrey Loughlin, with some of the other depth, and obviously a Harry Stewart, a freshman coming in for KU this season who might get some action as well. You also have this depth of running backs with this ability where it allows you to mix up different looks that can confuse the defense and helps out your quarterback. But B, also, it allows you to have games like this one where Devin Neal has such huge impact, but you don't need to overwork him, right? In this game, he ends up with only 12 carries. Daniel Highshaw gets 19. And I think in a vacuum, you'd think, whoa, Devin Neal should be getting the ball way more than that. But in games like this where it's, hey, listen, we have a chance to kind of do this by committee to where, hey, there's going to be that game down the line where Devin Neal's going to get 32 carries. There's going to be that Oklahoma State, down the line where we need to give him the ball 30 times. But it doesn't need to be every game, right? I think that speaks to the depth that Kansas has as well at the running back position, where you can lean on Daniel Highshaw. You can lean on some of the guys you have as well to not only help the quarterback, but help Devin Neal as well.
I agree. And to your point on UCF maybe asking that what-if question about if they had started with Timmy McClain, this thing becomes a shootout a little bit in the second half. Obviously, by that point, Kansas up 31-0. Kansas is going to go on to win. But they started trading haymakers kind of back and forth a little bit. UCF finally gets on the board on the next drive, aided by a 53-yard run by R.J. Harvey. Nick, looking at the running backs in the Big 12 for this year, obviously, Ollie Gordon is a Heisman Trophy candidate. Taj Brooks is just terrific. I put Devin Neal in with those guys. RJ Harvey is either in that group or just like a slight half step down from that group, which really shows how just absolutely loaded this conference is with runners, because you could keep going down it and say, oh, well, DJ Giddens and Dylan Edwards, you could pretty much bounce around the Big 12 and find great backs pretty much everywhere. West Virginia's got like 35 really good running backs. Yeah, and so RJ Harvey, though, the 53-yard run, RJ Harvey's as good as just about anybody in the conference.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I remember looking at the running backs that this conference had going into last season, like before the season started in the summer of 2023, and thinking, gosh, running backs, maybe that's not really a strong part of this conference. And then I was obviously way wrong on that. I mean, Ollie Gordon turns into a phenomenal player, as you said, a Heisman candidate. We know about Devin Neal. Kansas State has some pretty quality running backs as well. And yeah, it turned into a conference with great running backs, and that maybe just kind of emphasizes the point that Kansas needs to make sure that they feel confident in their front seven. And we've highlighted the pass rush a lot, but stopping the run could be equally as important if you're going to be going up against week in and week out really high quality talented running backs.
Yeah, for sure. But Kansas wasn't done. the two teams were going to trade. You're going to give the ball to Daniel Highshaw. He breaks a 29-yard run. He got a bunch of work in this drive. Dylan McDuffie was getting work in this drive. And how about Jason Bean? We talked about the passing. He winds up 8 for 12 passing on the day for 91 yards. But he converted multiple third downs with his arm. And on this drive, he runs for 17, I think, on the third down, keeps the drive going with his legs, and then winds up with a Dylan McDuffie touchdown.
Yep. So at that point, you make it 37-6. One thing I wanted to point out is UCF, they went for 2 on their touchdown.
Yep.
We didn't get it. So it was 31-6. And then, as you said, Kansas goes on this drive with a lot of runs. And this is actually the last drive of the game. So this is with 10 minutes left in the third quarter. This is the last drive of the game in which Jason Bean attempts a pass. Kansas goes into full conservative clock, NCAA football 14, HB dive mode through the rest of this game. And yet they were still scoring touchdowns. And on this drive, they do end up going down and scoring. And then you kind of alluded to it earlier, but this was where another special teams play kind of rears its head in not a great way, where the extra point gets blocked and UCF takes it back for 2. So it was 31-6, then 37-6, then it becomes 37-8 with the 2 points going the other way for UCF.
Yeah, and it not a big deal in a game like this, but I'm guessing, Nick, that we'll get to a game later this season where an extra point could wind up being fairly big and playing a major part of the final result. But
yeah,
at this point, you're kind of saying, okay, it's 37-8. That's not ideal on that kick or whatever, but also not necessarily a huge deal. And at that point, it's you wind up UCF gets the ball back. They go on their own, just War and Peace type drive, an 8-minute drive. I think 17 plays, running the ball a bunch. I think at one point they had a 3rd and 7 that they converted with a run, and so UCF goes down, adds another touchdown with the running game. But at this point, Kansas probably pretty happy to give up an 8-minute drive, with what the scoreline is.
Yeah, I think this is one where it's like this is the type of drive where if this is a close game, it just rips your heart out. Where they go down and take 8 minutes, but when you're up by 30, who cares, right? Like take 8 minutes, take 10 minutes, take however much time, whatever the hell you want, however much time you want. So yeah, it was probably a pretty grueling drive, but as it was happening, but in the macro context of this game, it didn't really matter that much because it took literally the remaining of the third quarter and into the early fourth quarter to make it 37-15. And then Kansas responds again. They weren't done. There was on the next drive, there was a face mask penalty against UCF that helped aid the next drive for Kansas as they continued to just run the ball. Daniel Highshaw was just a monster on this drive, a couple of really long runs, and he ended up getting the touchdown run for Kansas to make it 44-15. UCF then comes back again, and they go down with a quicker drive this time. Instead of 8 minutes, they take about 90 seconds. They go down and score to make it 44-22. But again, this game was always at hand. There was never any real concern. I mean, at that point, you're talking 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter. You're up by 22, 3 scores, so you're feeling pretty good. But Kansas does go down. They get the ball back, and, to kind of go back to the special teams discussion, they go down, and Seth Keller ends up missing a relatively short field goal.
Yep.
Right? This is another one where in this game it doesn't matter, but in future games it does matter. And going forward, it certainly matters, right? Because I think if you're Kansas, and listen, you could circle the Kansas State game, Oklahoma State games that we will get to, that Kansas was right there with their opponent in terms of the level of play, and what kind of tipped the scale one way or the other ended up being the special teams. So you hope that Kansas can focus on that and shore it up heading into 2024.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's sort of the one area. And like you said, it's not even that Keller was bad or whatever else, or the kicking game was bad. It was inconsistent. And it wound up biting them a couple times, that inconsistency. And so when you're looking at, 2024, you're hoping that group takes sort of that next step forward. Obviously it would be nice if, Keller didn't have the biggest leg, for one thing. And so it'd be nice if they were able to put themselves in a situation where you could make, a 45, 50-yard field goal in a clutch situation, or not feel bad about being in that position. But if they can get to a point where, extra points, not really an inconsistency or things like that, that would be a big takeaway.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. The kicking game for Kansas in 2023 was not bad, right? I think in 2022 it was bad. I'm willing to say in 2022 it was bad. Kansas went out and tried to remedy that in 2023, and they did get better, but they were still inconsistent, as you said. So we'll see what kind of steps they take forward into 2024. But so you have that missed field goal late in the fourth quarter. Again, kind of irrelevant because you're up by 3 scores. UCF eventually tries to go for it on a fourth down. They get stopped. And Kansas kind of just adds a little insult to injury with another touchdown, this time on a run by Dylan McDuffie. They basically just fed him, I think, like 6 straight times, and he just kept going and goes and scores. 51-22, Kansas wins. They're now 5-1, 2-1 in conference. A big bounce back win against UCF, and you're feeling pretty good, right? You're feeling pretty good after this win for KU bouncing back.
Yeah, you're a game away from bowl eligibility. You've got a trip to Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma State had been a little hit or miss. Obviously getting run by South Alabama. Responded well this week, actually, that we're talking about, by beating K-State. And I think that was a little bit of a surprise given how Oklahoma State had played prior to that point. But you're a win away from bowl eligibility. I think a lot of people, Nick, and I'm certainly in that discussion, I thought Jalen Daniels would be back for Oklahoma. And I think, we'll talk more about this, and there's no need to belabor the point. But with there being a bye week and then Oklahoma, we didn't know the extent of the back injury, and we knew that it was something that could act up or whatever else. I kind of felt like, okay, you just beat UCF. You're gonna go into Stillwater, which is going to be a tough game. Then Jalen has 2 weeks basically after that to get healthy and get back. And so to me, your win, you get right up there next to bowl eligibility. Jalen Daniels at this point, we don't know, is done for the season, all of those things. And so things are trending in a really positive direction. You run for almost 400 yards. Yeah. And even beyond that, you were talking about the depth at running back, and, Evan Neal went for 154. Highshaw went for 134. McDuffie went for 91. And so you had basically, you were just off having 3 different running backs run for over 100 yards. And so you felt like that was something you could take forward. And certainly, I think one of the biggest takeaways about this game is whether it was, the returns, whether it was the running game, whether it was the way the defense started off. This was about as physical a performance as I think you could remember out of KU. And remember, we've talked about this before. In 2022, Kansas ran the ball a lot with scheme, right? It was get you leading left, run the ball right. It was not a lot of people realized that Kansas was going to lean into the option game the way that they did. And so a lot of it was, tricking other teams into giving up gaffes and things of that nature. This was a game, Nick, where I really felt like Kansas lined up and ran the ball when and where it wanted. I think there was one of the, I got to look really quickly, but I think there was a fourth quarter, like a long third down that Kansas converted, just running the ball. And that takes the dog right out of the defense when you're there and you're kind of like, we could potentially get a stop here. And then you give up that kind of running play, and it's just there's nothing good to take away from it.
Well, just to kind of underscore that thought, I mean, Kansas gained a majority of those yards, near 399, just 1 yard off 400.
Yeah,
they gained a majority of those yards in situations where UCF knew the run was coming. This was a situation where they were lining up, and there was nothing, there was nothing deceptive about it. They were lining up to run the ball right at UCF, and UCF knew it was coming and could not stop it. That's really what jumped out to me about this is, to your point, there's been games in the past where Kansas, with their scheme, with maybe some motion and option type stuff, is kind of how they open up their different running opportunities. No, and especially in the second half. I mean, listen, Jason Bean threw his last pass with 10 minutes left in the third quarter. So they're running the ball every play. UCF knows it's coming, and they still were gaining big yards.
I think the announcers used the phrase washed out, like in terms of the offensive line just washing out the defensive line, talking about Kansas on 3 or 4 different plays where they just said Kansas just took these guys and moved them out of the way. And that was one of the things that we talked about heading into the season, right? You felt like that was an area where after that Arkansas game, they wanted to get more physical. They wanted to get to where they could impose their will on people. And this was an example of Kansas doing exactly that.
Yeah, and the other takeaway I had from this game was, hey, listen, it was great that Jason Bean was able to kind of manage things and get you this win. But to me, I thought immediately it was very clear that if you were going to win against Oklahoma State, Jason Bean was going to have to make some plays, right? You were not going to be able to use the same blueprint, the same strategy that you used against UCF to go win more games. You were going to need your quarterback to make some plays. Going forward, which was at the time a somewhat concerning thought, legitimately, just about whether or not that was possible, whether or not Jason Bean could do that, whether or not he could go out and make those plays that could win you games. But that was my thought was, hey, listen, 8 of 12 for 91 yards and a touchdown, fantastic. You managed the game when Kansas was up basically from start to finish, but I don't know how replicable that is going forward. And you're going to need just to make some plays. And again, to your point, at that point in time, we weren't sure exactly the extent of Jalen Daniels' injury. And the idea was, okay, maybe you go to Oklahoma State, and if Jason Meade can make some plays, you have a chance to win, and then hopefully you can get Jalen Daniels back.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly where I sat. And so, yeah, it was a great win. It was a really, a much-needed bounce back after what happened against Texas. And even beyond that, players had talked about wanting to compete for the Big 12 title, getting that win, losing at Texas, not really a death blow to your Big 12 title hopes. Now, letting that turn into multiple losses or whatever else, they were still on track to compete for that at that point. And heading into Stillwater, you felt like, hey, if you can steal a game out of Stillwater, that puts you exactly where you want to be to potentially win the conference. And it turns out, that wound up being a really huge game in that Big 12 title race.
So Kansas moves to 5-1. They're halfway through the 2023 season. We're halfway through the 2023 season. We're halfway through the offseason, really, as we get closer to the start of 2024. So thanks for listening in for another edition of the Jayhawk Rewind here on the Paid Podcast as we move 1 week closer to the start of the 2024 season. If you like what you heard or if you like what you watch, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like, subscribe, leave us a comment, give us your thoughts, give us maybe how you were feeling at this point in time last season, and also leave us a 5-star rating and review as well if you're listening on Apple or Spotify on the audio side. But he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. This is Fahey. We'll be back once again as we continue with our Jayhawk Rewind series throughout this offseason, and we will talk to you again soon. See ya.